All right, good morning, everybody. Looks like we've got a good crowd for our training today. Um, I am Sarah Thunberg, um, and I have my coworker Stephanie Frechette here with me today. Um, so, yeah, I'm hope you're all excited to learn about elevation certificates. Um, so today we're going to be giving a bit of an overview of elevation certificates. And this training is going to be more focused towards community officials as the ones receiving and reviewing elevation certificates. Yeah, we're going to talk about who fills out elevation certificates, when they're needed, a review of each of the sections, and highlighting some of the most important information for floodplain managers to know, um, as well as checking for compliance and determining the base flood elevation, um, and wrap up with some common certificate errors and helpful resources. I see that we have a hand raised. Before we really get going, I just want to make sure, like, can everybody hear me and see the screen? All right. And Jim, if you have a question, feel free to unmute or put any questions in the chat. All right. I'm gonna continue on just so that we can get through today, and there will be time for questions at the end.
Jim had a question, but am I the only one who hears you? So you're through a fish tank. And
Stephanie, did you want to take over?
Okay, thanks, Sarah. So here we're going to be, can everyone hear me okay? Can I get a thumbs up? Okay, thank you. So we're going to be providing an overview of the elevation certificate. The National Flood Insurance Program Elevation Certificate is an administrative tool. It can be used to provide elevation information for 3 different purposes. So one of them is to ensure compliance with NFIP requirements. For communities that participate in NFIP, which is the majority of communities in New Hampshire, they have adopted and enforced community floodplain regulations. One of the community's requirements is to require and obtain as-built elevation data for all new and substantially improved structures that are located within a special flood hazard area. Community permitting officials must review this elevation data to ensure floodplain development complies with the regulations. And although not required as part of their NFIP participation, communities are strongly encouraged to require applicants to submit a completed elevation certificate as the method to document the required elevation data. Communities that also participate in the NFIP community rating system are required to obtain and maintain elevation certificates for all new and substantially improved structures. Another purpose for the elevation certificate is for insurance. The elevation certificate can be used to highlight mitigation actions to lower flood risks. For example, the elevation certificate shows the location of the building, the lowest floor elevation, building characteristics, and the flood zone. The certificate is no longer required to purchase flood insurance coverage, although a property owner may choose to provide an elevation certificate to determine if it will lower their insurance costs. And then thirdly, the elevation certificate can be used for a map amendment or to support a letter of map amendment application to remove a structure from the special flood hazard area. In this case, a licensed land surveyor, engineer, or an architect must complete either the elevation form of the LOMA application or a FEMA elevation certificate. And more information about the LOMA process can be found in a fact sheet that we have available on our website, which we will include a link later on in the presentation. Here are ways that you can obtain an elevation certificate. So one would be by contacting a New Hampshire licensed land surveyor, a registered professional engineer, or a registered architect. Or in some cases, a community's building permitting office may have a copy of a structure's elevation certificate on file. All right, I will pass it back over to Sarah to talk about the elevation certificate and the community rating system.
All right, and just to answer the questions in the Q&A, so I think we're not having any issues with the audio on our end, so I think it might be a local issue with any if you're having any issue with the audio. But yes, we will be sharing these presentation slides after the fact, and there will be a recording posted to YouTube. Okay, so elevation certificates and the community rating system. So if you are unaware of what that is, it is a voluntary program in addition to the National Flood Insurance Program where communities will be rewarded for having higher than the minimum NFIP standards and they're rewarded with a discounted NFIP premium for all residences or for all residents with a NFIP policy in that community. So one of the requirements of being a CRS community is that they're required to submit elevation certificates for all construction that is in the special flood hazard area. And that is part of the annual recertification where all of the elevation certificates get submitted and reviewed by the CRS team. And they're checked for errors and any compliance issues. And if any of those are found, then those do need to get addressed. Okay. So the, whoops. Yeah, so generally for CRS review for the elevation certificates, at least 90% of the community's elevation certificates have to be correct with no issues. And if not, then this community must correct all of those compliance errors in order to stay within the CRS program. And the community CRS score depends on the correctness of the elevation certificates. So I have a quiz here, and you can just put your answers in the chat. And so the question is, does an elevation, or true or false, an elevation certificate certifies whether or not a building is compliant within the community floodplain regulations and minimum NFIP standards? So you can just put true or false in the chat and we'll tell you the answer in a moment. All right, so getting a lot of correct answers here in the chat. False is correct. So an elevation certificate is just a report of the existing conditions. It is the engineer or surveyor's stamp, does not certify that the structure is compliant. It only certifies the accuracy of the elevation data. It is the community's responsibility to then review the elevation certificate for completeness and accuracy and then determine whether or not it is a compliant structure. So even with a professional surveyor or engineer's seal, it's possible that there may be mistakes on the elevation certificate. And so you want to review that every time you get an elevation certificate, you want to make sure that you are reviewing it against your community's local floodplain regulations based off of the final construction to determine building compliance. You also want to verify that all necessary data has been collected to determine the building's compliance and ensure that the elevation certificate makes sense. Essentially, the lowest floor is lower than the highest floor because sometimes those data points can get flip-flopped. So you just want to make sure it makes logical sense. All right, so we're going to now go into a section by section review of the elevation certificate, and Stephanie is going to start us off on that.
Okay, thank you. All right, so these are the 9 different sections of the elevation certificate form that we'll go through, and we'll highlight the purpose of each section, who fills out that section, and focus on the key points that community officials should be concerned about when reviewing and verifying information in elevation certificates. There used to be 7 sections, but the last 2 are new, which focus on first floor height and owner certification. There are instructions on the form which are pretty well written and should be able to answer most of your questions. So we recommend reading the instructions thoroughly before completing or reviewing the elevation certificate. And some sections are completed in every circumstance, and some sections are only completed for properties that are within certain flood zones. So we'll discuss the takeaways of each section and what information is required in each. This slide is showing who can complete which sections of the elevation certificate. Only a few of these are required to be completed by a licensed professional or a specified staff member, such as the building elevations where a survey is needed, and then the following section for the survey certification information, as well as community information, which must be completed by a local official. But all the other sections can be completed by community officials, property owners, and it doesn't require a licensed professional or a specified staff person. So the first section is for property information. This can be filled out by anyone or doesn't require a specified community official or a licensed professional. This section includes general information about the property, including contact information, the property address, property descriptions such as the tax map and lot information, GPS coordinates, square footage, flood openings, and this specifies building use, so whether it's residential or non-residential. And this section is to be completed for properties in all flood zones, generally A zones and V zones. Within section A, there's a spot for the building diagrams, and just to give some background information on what this is, the building diagrams are diagrams that classify a structure's specific construction and foundation, which is essential for determining flood risk. The building diagrams are found on pages 7 through 9 on the elevation certificate instructions, and the elevations indicated on the building diagram correspond to the elevations to be entered in section C of the form. And how does this pertain to a community official for planning purposes? Well, looking at this from a planning perspective, it's important to understand that there are different building diagrams that classify the structure, and the classification has an impact on how the risk is calculated in terms of the vulnerability to flooding, as well as how the insurance premiums are calculated. So if the property is misclassified, there's also the potential for the property to be non-compliant with local floodplain regulations. I'm not going to be discussing these in great detail, but I just wanted to highlight that there are several different building diagrams. There's a total of 11, and they all vary. So as mentioned, the elevations indicated on the building diagram correspond to the elevations to be entered in section C of the form. So just be aware that there's 11 different building diagrams. Enclosures below the lowest floor is basically a space like a crawl space or a garage under the first floor that's used for living. The things to pay attention to in this section are whether the property has the required flood openings, which we'll be discussing later on, and whether flood-resistant materials were used if below the BFE, and if required elevations were followed to prevent flood damage. These are crucial for insurance rate calculations and issuing certificates of occupancy. This section helps local officials determine things like assessing the flood risk and determining whether the property is in the special flood hazard area, understanding the venting requirements. So if the required vents are present, their size, location, and if they allow water passage to equalize the pressure. They determined the location of utilities like HVAC and electrical utilities and whether they are elevated to prevent damage. Lowest floor determination, so whether the lowest floor is used for living or for storage. And the section helps confirm whether the property is NFIP compliant and whether the building can withstand flood events. There's also a section on attached garages. An attached garage is an enclosed space used for parking that is adjacent to the main structure. When reviewing elevation certificates, community officials should be concerned with the garage. If it's below the BFE, it must have flood openings. Any utilities, HVAC, water heater, etc., must be elevated or moved and protected from flooding. Have a living space above the garage does not change its designation as an attached garage. And just paying attention to whether it's a garage or a basement. An attached garage is an enclosed area mainly used for parking. A subgrade basement or a sunken garage below ground level on all sides is not considered an attached garage. That would be a basement. And common errors that you might see on the form is an incorrect designation, so mislabeling a subgrade garage as an attached garage when that would be a basement, neglecting flood openings when they're required, and not including machinery or equipment elevations. So the key points for this first section is this is required for all flood zones. It can be filled out by anybody. It doesn't require a specified community official or a licensed professional to fill out. We generally see this for A zones and B zones. This section includes general information about the property, including the contact information, phone numbers, tax map and lot information, GPS coordinates, and it specifies the building use, residential or non-residential. And another takeaway is understanding the building diagrams and the impact of misclassifying one, understanding how to handle enclosures below the lowest floor, what to look for, and how to ensure compliance with NFIP. And for attached garages, making sure the garage was accurately labeled, noting the square footage and any required flood openings if it's below the BFE. Next is Section B, the flood insurance rate map information. This is also to be completed for all flood zones, and the information here includes community information such as the FEMA ID for that municipality, the base flood elevation, the source of the base flood elevation, so whether that was retrieved from the flood insurance study report, the flood insurance rate maps, if it was determined by the community or another source, the datum source for identifying that BFE, and just so you know, the vertical datum that applies is listed on the map panels and in the flood insurance study report. This section is useful to the floodplain administrator because it's directly giving you base flood information to help ensure compliance with the National Flood Insurance Program. For most AE zones, the BFE should be taken from the flood insurance study report and not the map panel. This is because the flood insurance study report has more accuracy and the depth value should be to the 10th of a foot. So for example, 140.4 feet as opposed to just 140 feet. In AO zones, the BFE should be the depth number that's on the flood insurance rate map. In V zones, coastal areas, the BFE should be the elevation on the flood insurance rate map. And in A zones, if no BFE is available, you should put NA. And a little later on, Sarah will cover A zones and AO zones in more detail. So the key points for this section is that it's required for all flood zones. It doesn't need to be required by a licensed professional. Know your community flood zones, and if you're not sure, definitely reach out to us. Know how to use and where to find the flood insurance study report and the flood insurance rate maps to verify information. The next two sections are building elevation information and surveyor certification. The purpose of the building elevation information section is to compare floor elevations against the BFE because higher floor elevations generally leads to lower insurance premiums. And this section is looking at lowest floor elevation, the elevation of machinery and equipment, and the ground level elevation, all in relation to the base flood elevation. This section should be used to confirm that the construction complies with local floodplain management rules. Also, this part requires certification from a surveyor, which is the purpose of the next section. And this is not applicable for every flood zone. It's only if the structure is within the special flood hazard area. This is to highlight the highest adjacent grade and the lowest adjacent grade. The highest adjacent grade is the highest natural elevation of the ground surface next to a structure. It is measured immediately next to the proposed walls of a structure before construction begins. This measurement is important for determining the appropriate elevation for the lowest floor of a building, and it's used in floodplain management regulations to ensure that new constructions are elevated above potential flood levels. And the lowest adjacent grade is the lowest ground level next to the structure. So it's immediately next to a building foundation after construction, and it's used to determine whether a property falls within the special flood hazard area. The floor with the lowest elevation, so in other words, a basement, a crawl space, or an enclosure floor, is the definition for a lowest floor. This determines whether the structure is compliant with local floodplain ordinances. The surveyor completing this section is filling out information for things like the top of the bottom floor, top of next higher floor, the bottom of the lowest horizontal structural member, which is for V zones only, the lowest elevation of machinery and equipment, the lowest adjacent grade next to the building, the highest adjacent grade. So I just wanted to highlight the surveyor would be filling out this information, and that's the information that would be included. And in order for a building to be compliant with your community's floodplain ordinance, the lowest floor must be built to or above the base flood elevation, plus any freeboard requirements if your community has that. So the takeaways for this section is it records building elevation information, including the lowest floor, machinery and equipment, adjacent grades, and more. It is required for the following flood zones. So A 1 through 30, AE zones, AH, zone A's with a BFE, V zones with a BFE. It is completed by a licensed professional and a survey is required. And the survey details elevation of the lowest floor, the next higher floor, the lowest adjacent grade, etc. These elevations determine the insurance premiums. And this provides a finished construction rating, which confirms the final elevations after all grading and development is completed. Section D is the surveyor certification that goes hand in hand with the previous section. And this is to be completed if the property has a determined BFE. The elevation certificate for this kind of property must be completed by a surveyor, an engineer, or an architect who is registered in the state. Look at your paper copies to see that Section D starts on the bottom of the form and continues on the top back. That's just a reminder to make sure you're filling it out completely. And this is another location where errors can be made if the person completing the form forgets to turn over the form and add the signature and the seal that's required. This document must be an original and it won't be accepted if it's not the original. So those are the main takeaways. So and I will pass it back over to Sarah to talk about the remaining sections.
All right. So these remaining sections are looking at some or adding more detail to the requirements that have already been in previous sections. So Section E is the building measurement information. This is generally, so the survey is not required for this section, and generally these are for zones A, O, and A, essentially any flood zones where the BFE isn't immediately apparent. And so on this section, it is providing the measurements for the top of the bottom floor, including basements and crawl space, as well as the building diagrams and attached garage. Essentially, these are all of the details that are in a previous section, but more explicitly spelled out here. So Section F is just the property owner certification or the property owner's authorized representative certifying that everything here is correct to the best of their knowledge, as well as any additional comments or details for the elevation certificate. So similar to Section D, this Section F is just for, wait, yeah. Yeah, it's just for the owner certification. And the types of comments that you want to add in this section are the type and location of machinery and utilities, any unique building characteristics and whether the interior grade was used to determine whether or not the openings are within 1 foot of grade, which is one of the requirements I'll talk about later, and any other details that need explanation on the elevation certificate. All right, so section G is for community information, and it is for the convenience of the community. Essentially, this is an easy way to keep track of the permitting in the community. It's just for floodplain management purposes. And yeah, again, this section is not required, but yeah, it's just for ease of the community. So section H is similar to previous sections where it is providing additional details for the building's first floor height. Again, survey is not required for this section, and a lot of this information is repeated in section C, but for this section, you want to provide the height of the top of the floor above the lowest adjacent grade. And these are specifically for building types 1A, 1B, 3, and 5 to 8. And then the second part is for building diagrams 2A, 2B, 4, and then 6 through 9. So last section is, again, owner certification, property owner certification. Yeah, this one is pretty self-explanatory. Just put in the address and any additional comments to note with the elevation certificate. So those are the specific sections of the elevation certificate. Now, as a community official, you are likely not filling out most of these sections, and what you're really looking for is checking for compliance. So now I'm going to talk about the most important things as a floodplain administrator to check for on an elevation certificate. So the first most important thing that you need to be checking is the construction heights. So the minimum NFIP regulation is that the construction has been completed at least or has been elevated to at least the BFE or higher, depending on the freeboard requirements of the community. So what you want to check here is make sure you know what the BFE is, and then you want to check that the top of the bottom floor, so this red box, and the lowest elevation of machinery and equipment, including utilities, this box, both of those have to be at least as high as the BFE, plus whatever the freeboard requirements of your community or state are. In New Hampshire, we have a minimum freeboard requirement of 1 foot. So all communities in New Hampshire have to have their development within the floodplain elevated at least 1 foot above the BFE. So there can be some unique cases where the BFE isn't immediately apparent and requires a tiny bit of math to figure out. So that is for zone A, which is where we see a lot of errors sometimes. So zone A is the special flood hazard area, which does not have any BFE information. So there's 2 ways to go about this. Either the surveyor would have determined a BFE and listed it on the elevation certificate, and if that is the case, then you can go ahead and use that BFE. But if they did not determine a BFE, or if if you're not requiring an elevation certificate for the construction, you still need to make sure that the construction is above the BFE. So you can also determine that the BFE is 2 feet above the highest adjacent grade for development within Zone A. That is something that you have to make sure is in your community's floodplain ordinance as we go through adopting the new maps. We are making sure that all of the communities, if you would like to have this language, is incorporated into the town's ordinance, but that is a more cost-effective way of determining or of ensuring compliance for Zone A without needing to go through the whole survey process. So another unique BFE scenario is in AO zones. So these are zones with areas of shallow flooding. And generally on the flood insurance rate map, you will see zone AO depth either 1 through 3 feet. So the BFE for these zones is the highest adjacent grade plus the depth on the map. So for example, if we're in a zone AO depth 3 with a highest adjacent grade of 17.4 feet, you want to add the depth and the highest adjacent grade together to get a BFE of 20.4 feet. So that would be how you determine the BFE for zone AO, and then you would want to add any additional freeboard requirements on top of that BFE. So in some cases, if you are a community with a freeboard requirement of 2 feet, the way that it would work out is that the minimum building height would have to be 5 feet above the BFE in this case. So I know that can be kind of confusing, but the calculations really are pretty simple. And again, if you have any questions on this, we will be sharing the slides, and we're also happy to, if you want to run an elevation certificate by us, if you have a question about whether or not you've done the calculation correctly, we're happy to do that. All right, so some other things that might come up when you're reviewing an elevation certificate. And that is enclosures that extend below the BFE. So for new construction or substantial improvements, the lowest floor must be elevated to the BFE or higher if the community has a higher freeboard standard. And the enclosures allowed below the BFE must be used solely for storage, building access, and parking. They cannot be below grade on all sides, and they have to contain the required number of flood openings for the square footage of the enclosure. And in the next couple slides, I will spell out exactly what that rule is. So there are some enclosures where flood openings must be required. So that includes any solid perimeter foundation walls with crawl spaces or full height underfloor spaces, other underfloor spaces where manufactured homes are installed. They also are required for garages attached to elevated buildings, enclosed areas with breakaway walls under the buildings, and on open foundations. And this is for all zones. They're also required for enclosed area under the buildings, elevated on open foundation in Zone A areas, as well as accessory structures. So what is a flood opening and what are the requirements? So a flood opening is a permanent opening that allows for the free passage of water automatically in both directions, in and out of the basement, without human intervention. So there can't be someone who has to go physically open the vent It must be automatic. And a window, a door, or a garage is not considered an opening, but you may install openings indoors. So the total amount of openings required is you must have 1 square inch of flood opening for every 1 square foot of enclosed area. They have to be at least on 2 sides of the enclosed area, and if you have more than one enclosed area, each of those areas must have openings to allow water to enter. And yes, that is to allow water to enter into the basement. It can be a common misconception that these flood openings are to keep your basement dry. That is incorrect. So the purpose of the flood openings is to equalize water pressure, both inside and outside your basement. Because if you think of your foundation wall, during a flood, the water is going to rise up against your foundation and be pushing against your foundation. And if you have nothing but empty space on the other side of that foundation wall, that's going to be an unequal pressure distribution, and then your foundation could crumble. So what we want to do is we want to allow the water to, as it is rising outside, to then go into the basement so that it equalizes the pressure both inside and outside the foundation so that you don't have a failing foundation wall. Now, the flood openings cannot be more than 1 foot above grade. So that's either interior or exterior, whichever one is higher. And there are 2 types of flood openings. So there are engineered openings and non-engineered openings. The engineered openings are designed and certified by a registered design professional as meeting the performance required by regulations. Now, the non-engineered openings are used to satisfy the prescriptive requirements, so that 1 square inch for 1 square foot of enclosure. There's a wide variety of options available to satisfy these requirements. Here's an example of what the engineered vents look like. They come with a certification, and they tend to be pretty robust, but they automatically open as soon as the pressure gets uh, a certain amount. Now, the non-engineered flood openings, they look like this, or they can look like this. And essentially, these just have to meet the requirements of the square footage to square inch requirement. So, for example, if you have an 800 square foot enclosure, you have to have at least 800 square inches of openings. And that will be, there's a, in section A on the elevation certificate, there is a spot to put the amount of square footage of the enclosure as well as the rated square foot or square inch or the rating square foot coverage of the flood opening. All right, so we're going to, before we wrap up, just go through a little bit of a review example. So for this review, we're going to use the scenario where the community has permitted a new construction of a 1-story residential structure with a crawl space and attached garage, and it is in zone AE. The community requires at least 1 foot of freeboard, and the community conducted inspections during the construction, and currently the construction has been completed, and we are reviewing a finished construction elevation certificate. So this would be the house in question. It would be building diagram number 8. So we can see that there is still a little bit of a crawl space under the house with an attached garage. All right, so section A, we have the building owner's name, the address, city, as well as a property description, whether or not it's a residential or non-residential use. You want to make sure that the building diagram is correct, as well as the elevation data. You want to make sure that you're using the correct elevation datum. There is the NAVD of 1927 versus the NAVD of 1983. So you also need to ensure that the square footage requirement is met. So this this structure has a total square footage of enclosure of 720 square feet. And they do have non-engineered flood openings with totaling a net area of 800 square inches. So that will satisfy the square footage to square inch requirement of the flood openings. Now, the attached garage also has been listed with the square footage, but there are no flood openings in the attached garage, so that the number of permanent flood openings would be NA in this case. You do want to make sure that every section is at least filled out, even if it's not applicable, because that would it then indicate to the person reviewing it that you have at least looked through and thought about every aspect of the elevation certificate. And if there are any questions, that we know it wasn't just left out by mistake. So we want to use the review checklist, which is actually been developed for the CRS program, but it's really helpful for all communities in reviewing elevation certificates. So what we're going to check for this one is that the net area of the flood openings is greater than or equal to the square footage of enclosure. Yes, that's great. Does the number of flood openings within 1 foot of grade appear correct? Yes, it does. If there are engineered flood openings, is there accompanying documentation? There's non-engineered flood openings in this case. This would not be applicable. And then if there are any openings, do they meet the same requirement noted above for the enclosures? Yes, there is enough square inch for the square footage of the enclosure. All right, so section B, we just want to make sure all of the community information is correct. And this is where you're going to want to double check that the flood zone and the BFE are correct. So if you're able to, if it's in a zone AE where you can check it on the map, or the flood insurance study, you want to go ahead and do that and make sure that they're using the most detailed BFE. In some cases where a letter of map amendment or a letter of map change is in progress, or if there has been one submitted in the past, you want to make sure that if they're citing a BFE that was determined in a letter of map amendment, that it was an accepted and approved letter of map amendment, because there sometimes you will still receive a letter saying that this is certifying a non-removal of the property, and that even if a BFE was determined, that letter of map amendment might not have been accepted. And so you want to verify that if there is a BFE that is being cited here from a letter of map amendment, you want to make sure that that is an approved and accepted letter of map amendment and BFE determination. Because I have seen that mistake been made in the past. All right, so in section C, this is where we are checking all of the heights of the enclosures. So actually, if I go back, in this case, we're looking at a BFE of 211.5 feet, and the community has 1 foot of freeboard. So we want to make sure that all of these elevations are at least 212.5 feet, which the top of the bottom floor is at least 212.5 feet, so that should be sufficient, as well as the machinery. The lowest adjacent grade does not have to be above the BFE. That's not part of the construction itself. So the review checklist, this is the review checklist for section C. Again, you want to be double checking that the bottom floor is at or above the BFE and to the required freeboard amount of the community. Whether or not there's an enclosure, is the enclosure compliant? Is there an attached garage and is it compliant? And then if the enclosure is compliant, then the lowest floor would then be determined as the next highest floor. And so then you would want to be checking the heights of that floor. All right, so section D, again, we want to make sure that they didn't forget the certification seal because that has happened. And also, if the utilities were not addressed previously, they definitely should be at least addressed in the comments. And if that is not the case, then that would not be, I would not consider that a complete elevation certificate. And so, yeah, you want to make sure that if there's anything that wasn't specifically addressed in within the fields of the elevation certificate form, they're at least addressed in the comments here. All right, so this is the checklist for that section C, and this is a this is incorrect for this community. They the bottom floor was at least above the BFE and met the community's freeboard requirements. But yeah, everything else with this particular example was correct. All right, so before we wrap up, I just wanted to go over some of the common errors that we see when reviewing elevation certificates. So I would say the most common error that I've found is either the incorrect flood zone designation or the wrong BFE designation. So if you're ever unsure about that, Stephanie and I are, again, more than happy to double check an elevation certificate for you. Just if you're not totally confident that it's compliant. Yeah, we're happy to help you out with that. So some other errors that are commonly seen are the wrong building diagram number, or that the machinery and equipment was not entered, or there's the incorrect community identification number, and using the wrong map panel, or listing the incorrect address, not fully filling out sections, incorrect community name, or you also want to make sure that there is a final completed construction elevation certificate. And yeah, again, incorrect designation of whether or not it's an attached garage, below grade garage, and also just date errors. So yeah, those are some of the most common errors that we see on elevation certificates. But yeah, so to wrap up, I highly recommend the CRS elevation certificate checklist. It is available through the crsresources.org, and it really provides a great way to be confident that you're reviewing elevation certificates correctly and with respect to your local regulations. And again, anyone can use this checklist. It is not just for CRS communities. It is uh, well, elevation certificates are required for CRS communities, but so there's resources that CRS has provided, but yeah, anyone is able to use them. So we have a fact sheet that we've created here at OPD for elevation certificates. And so there's a link that you can click on here to see the fact sheet. And then there's also a FEMA elevation certificate technical bulletin. And it was published in May 2004 with an overview of the elevation certificate, and that is linked here. Um, and yeah, so if you have any questions on whether or not you need to be reviewing elevation certificates or what aspects of the elevation certificates you really need to be paying attention to, please feel free to reach out to Stephanie and I. We're more than happy to help you build confidence in your program. And yeah, I guess now we will open it up for any questions. And so if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand, put it in the Q&A or the chat. But all right, we've got a question from Mike Landry. Let me know if you're not able to unmute yourself. I'm trying to, okay, there we go. You should be able to unmute now.
Um, can you hear me now?
Oh, yes, there we go.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Early on, I heard it said that the BFEs need to be determined using the flood insurance study. But on line B10, it seems to also include an option to obtain the BFE from the flood insurance rate map. Can we use the panels and the rate maps to determine the BFE?
Yes, so it's always a good idea to just check the flood insurance study because on occasion the flood insurance study will have a more accurate BFE. So on the flood insurance rate maps, they will be rounded to the nearest whole foot, but in some cases the flood insurance study will have something to the nearest tenth of a foot. And so it's good practice. You to use the most accurate one. But yes, if you can only find it in the flood insurance rate map, then by all means use that one because that is still the legal legal map.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you very much.
You're welcome. All right. Any other questions? All right, I'm not seeing any other questions coming through, and I do have 11 o'clock on the dot, so I will let you all go and have a great rest of your morning. And thank you so much for coming to today's training. We will be posting the recording to YouTube as well as sending out the presentation slides for everybody. But yeah, thank you for coming today.